Okay, you can tell by now that I'm a fan. Well, despite the brilliance of this argument and the brilliance of its biblical interpretation, the unknown factors of Hebrews, its date, its occasion, why is this letter being written or why is this sermon being delivered, its audience, who are they? Are they Jewish believers? Probably, but we can't be sure. And especially the identity of its author made it less respected than the four Gospels, the letters of Paul, and some of the other writings that we've seen, especially in the western part of the church. But the fact that Hebrews had a harder time achieving canonical status is noteworthy. It demonstrates that the church cared about its scriptures' integrity and their fidelity to the original apostolic tradition. The harder time that Hebrews as well as Revelation have demonstrates that the church cared about the reliability of its scriptures. And it demonstrates that these other writings, the four Gospels, the letters of Paul, first letter of Peter, more easily passed the church's tests and won their confidence. I'm going to engage in some sheer speculation and ask this question. Is Hebrews canonical because its Jesus was so recognizable to the apostolic churches? It so showed them the Jesus they already knew in their own memories and in the Gospels and the letters of Paul? Did they see the Jesus they knew in their own institutional memories, in the Gospels, in Paul's letters, Peter's letter? Did they see in Hebrews a reliable theologian? Did they see in this sermon a faithful rendering of the scriptures in light of the Jesus they knew? And did that win them over? The early church associated the letter of the Hebrews with Paul, although they were uneasy about whether Paul really wrote it. Nevertheless, it's in the canon right after all the other letters of Paul, from longest to shortest, and then comes Hebrews at the end, as if to say, maybe Paul, maybe not. But Origen and other fathers associated with Paul, maybe as a disciple. And that's a plausible case. You'll find theology in Paul that sounds like the theology here, although it differs in important ways. The way a master and a disciple have a lot in common, yet they have their own voices, and they differ in their perspectives and in their conclusions. You'll find theological resemblances between Hebrews and Paul. You'll find some shared assumptions and some shared theology, and you'll find differences, especially in interpreting these Old Testament texts. And the differences are some of the reasons that old and new readers think this isn't coming from Paul. Nevertheless, it's plausible that it came from a disciple of Paul. Disciples aren't just carbon copies of their masters. Disciples take what they've inherited and they work with it, and they use their own voice, and they see their own things, and they build on a legacy, but in their own distinctive ways. Rather than just piling on more highlights, I've already given you probably more than you want, I want to discuss some of Hebrews' legacies, some of the really powerful ways that this little sermon has influenced the Christian tradition. Number one, it has a high Christology. It takes Jesus' divinity seriously. Its attention to Jesus' humanity on the one hand and his deity on the other hand really influenced and guided the later church's doctrine of incarnation, and also the ways that the later church used the doctrine of incarnation to understand Jesus' person, God's threeness, the work of Christ in atonement, and so on. And yet, despite the theological influence of this little sermon, it still surprises. You might have been a little shocked if you read the first few chapters closely, and you thought, it sounds like Jesus has been treated as divine, and yet it sounds like Jesus' deity is that of a glorified human being. Well, that's right. The writer really wants to show us not just the deity of Jesus, but the glorifying and the perfecting of his humanity in a way that the later church sometimes paid attention to and sometimes has forgotten. The writer sees Jesus as more than just one person in two natures, human and divine. The writer sees Jesus as possessing a glorified and perfected humanity, which we too will inherit at our resurrection. So his incarnation yields our glorification. The typology in this sermon influences 1,500 years of biblical interpretation of both the Old Testament writings and the New Testament writings. You might say that this church of Watsons decided to become Sherlocks and follow the brilliance of this visionary. and look for more clues in the Old Testament writings that showed who Jesus is and what this plot is of the story that we're all characters in. And sometimes they got a little carried away. Sometimes they followed some leads that turned out not to be that reliable. And so modern scholars today tend to sort of have an ambivalent attitude about the interpretation of Scripture in the letter to the Hebrews. Now, I myself am a fan, but Watson ain't Sherlock. I think we need to be careful, or at least be humble, as we try to follow in the footsteps of the New Testament interpreters of the Old Testament, and do it with some reserve. Another legacy that you might have caught is the way that this shadow to reality language sounds like the Greco-Roman Platonistic tradition that Christianity fused with pretty early on. Hebrews can sound Platonistic. In fact, I think Hebrews probably does reflect some Hellenistic exposure to Platonic ideas of perfection and shadowy material imperfection. And that really encouraged the church to Platonize the Bible and to biblicize Platonism. It led to that fusion that I show you in this pearl of accumulated Christian tradition, which is not merely Jewish and apocalyptic, but a kind of synthesis of apocalyptic Judaism, non-apocalyptic Judaism, and Greco-Roman Greek thought of a variety of forms. Hebrews was one of the engines driving that fusion that was so successful and so influential that 2,000 years later, we're still doing it in ways we don't even identify without a pretty decent education in church history. For another powerful legacy, I want to flip over to Hebrews 11:13 to show you how Hebrews trained the church to think of itself as a church of pilgrims. The writer is about to list this incredible list of a cloud of witnesses. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they're seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. So we're not talking about ordinary Palestinian turf. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Then the writer goes on and begins with Abraham on down, listing triumphant examples of people who stayed faithful to sometimes the bitter end. This picture of a heavenly city so impressed itself on the imagination of the church, especially through Augustine's book, City of God, that Christians now almost all expect to go away from earth permanently and live forever in heaven in God's presence. And it can be a shock to read in Revelation the opposite image. A heavenly city, the New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven to rest on earth, and for us to live there on earth forever. Still a heavenly city, but not a city in heaven. Well, the way that the church has read Hebrews has really trained us in an otherworldly, heaven-bound perspective, which is actually foreign to a fair amount of the New Testament. Regardless of whether you think the ultimate human destination is earth or heaven, nevertheless, this is a pilgrimage. This life is a pilgrimage to a city which is to come. One legacy of Hebrews that's a pretty mixed legacy, and that's putting it pretty charitably, is the way that generations of Christians read it in an anti-Jewish direction. See, if Jesus is an upgrade on Melchizedek, on Joshua, on Moses, then that old version, that old covenant, looks not just inferior, but downright bad. Hebrews has unfortunately led generations of interpreters to read all of Judaism as an inferior and really a forsaken tradition. I think that's very far from the spirit of the letter to the Hebrews. When you read its list of pioneers of faith, people who ran the race, who stayed faithful even though they hadn't inherited what was promised. And remember, Hebrews is begging an audience not to turn away from what's actually been made available. So Hebrews is a long way from snobbery towards Jews or the people of the Old Covenant. Their faithful managed to bear up with nothing but promises, whereas we have more than just promises, and we walk away. Tragically, Christians have gotten into the habit of reading Hebrews' comparison of Old and New Covenants as a warrant for anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. In fact, it begets a whole school of interpretation called supersessionism, which thinks of God as basically abandoning the people of the Old Covenant promise since they rejected their Messiah, and God now treats them like any other nation. Well, that is not at all what Paul says in Romans 9 to 11. And I think if you read Hebrews closely, you can see it's not the heart of this sermon either. A final legacy that I want to point out is the way that the development of Jesus as priest here in this letter drives the way that the whole Western Church, both Catholic and Protestant, see atonement working on the cross. We think of the cross as a satisfaction of honor to pay for the dishonor of sinners. Or we think of the cross as a sacrifice that pays the penalty, the legal penalty for our sin. That rests on a basically priestly understanding of Jesus' work, and Hebrews is a prime source of understanding of how Jesus is our priest. Both Catholics and Protestants today tend to take for granted this interpretation of the cross as a sacrifice that pays for sin. This is certainly what Hebrews is arguing, although Hebrews is arguing it in some ways that we don't appreciate. Hebrews has a slightly different take on the role Jesus' blood plays. Despite these differences, Hebrews has been vastly influential in training us how to interpret the cross as atonement for sin. In all of these ways, Hebrews doesn't just give us a brilliant plot summary. Hebrews trains the church for 2,000 years in how to follow that plot line, find our place in the story, and live accordingly.